Marking its 40th anniversary in 2022, Blue Door is the largest emergency housing provider in York Region, providing life-saving support to children, youth, adults, seniors, and families at risk or experiencing homelessness. Along with offering emergency housing and housing retention support, in the past 2 years, Blue Door has expanded its service offering to further work toward preventing and ending homelessness through Inclusion, the first supportive housing program for 2 SLGBTQ+ youth in York Region. Construct, a social enterprise by Blue Door, providing supported skills training to help youth and adults break barriers to employment and secure meaningful careers in construction trades. And launching in 2022, a health hub which will include a nurse and in-reach system navigator to help people regain the health and well-being needed to secure and retain permanent housing. Join Blue Door's mission and become part of the solution by learning more at bluedoor.ca.
We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding homelessness and the incredible experts making a difference in the lives of homeless people. Remember to subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening and share it with a friend.
To another episode of On the Way Home. I am Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door, and this week we have not one, not two, but we have three amazing and brilliant guests and talking about something very, very important. Before we get to that, let me talk to you a little bit about the folks that bring you this podcast at Blue Door, my organization, and our friends at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. If you don't know, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness runs the biggest conference in our sector, in the homelessness and housing sector. That's going to happen at the beginning of November. Probably by the time this airs, you may or may not be able to get the early bird discount, but you want to get in and get registered to choose the different courses and speakers you're going to attend at that. It's both virtual. If you don't want to make the trip to Toronto, or you could go in person. It's the first time in a couple of years that they've been able to do it in person, so it's really great to get there and network and chat with people. But there is a virtual option as well. Check it out on there at cah.ca for their conference. They also do great work with the Built for Zero project that they're working on. If you want to become a Built for Zero community, and I encourage you to become a Built for Zero community, go to their website, chat with their team. They do great work, and they've reduced homelessness in numerous different cities throughout Canada with their leadership. So that's pretty cool. And my organization, Blue Door, most recently, probably one of the most recent podcasts we did, we are working with Habitat for Humanity and the GTA and a group called SHS Consultants, worked on a project called Dwell. And what Dwell looked at, it was a solutions lab where we looked at, could people have rent geared to income apartments, but still build equity? So they step away with equity. After 5 years, they step away with $10,000. We started on a path, could it lead to home ownership? And so we said, could it lead to similar benefits, why people want to own their home and sometimes have equity when they leave with something, so they can have different paths forward. So that's pretty cool. Check out Dwell and that podcast. We're working on that. And as this podcast drops, we most likely will be opening a new 18-unit transitional housing unit built by the Region of York, owned by the Region of York. They do great work. They did this in 18 months, which is incredible. It's a beautiful building, be dignified, affordable living for 18 people. So that's pretty cool. And in York Region, we need every unit that we can find. We're losing units at a rate of 15 to 1. So this is good news. So good things happening at Blue Door, good things happening at CH. But let's get to our guests today. Two of these guests are veterans on the podcast, and we have someone new as well. I always welcome new guests. I love this podcast selfishly because I learn so much every time we have guests on, and I love this stuff. So with us today, we have Dr. Kaitlin Schwan, who is the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network National Director. Now listen, if I was to read all these bios, because these three individuals are so accomplished, it would take the entire podcast. So we're just going to do a quick intro and then really get into a great conversation. I also have Khulud, Baig with me, Keepers of the Circle Housing and Homelessness Research Lead. Khulud has been on this podcast before. It continues to do great work as the Director of Policy and Community Engagement with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. And finally, I have Leah Lafferty, who's a Northern Dene Cree Métis novelist specializing in intellectual property law with a focus on mitigating cultural appropriation and Indigenous victimization in storytelling narratives. She is co-chair of the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Working Group. We ask this question at the beginning of every podcast because it means a little something different to everyone. There's similar themes, but that question is, what does home mean to you? Khulud, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Katlia, and we'll finish with Kaitlin.
So I guess that's a bit of a warped question for me because I call myself doubly displaced because my family history started somewhere in South Asia, and they were first displaced due to partition of India and Pakistan, and second displaced when I came to Canada and immigrated to Canada with my family and my parents. So home for me has a lot of meanings. I'm learning where my family comes from, where my ancestors come from, and then I'm trying to keep connected with a culture that I grew up in the first part of my life and kind of stays relevant as I continue living here on so-called Canada and Turtle Island. So for me, really, home is where community and people are, where I can connect with people and where I can feel most myself. And that's how I would define home.
Kaitlin, last word. What does home mean to you?
Yeah, love this question. An honor to be here with you folks and my colleagues. When I think about home, I've increasingly been thinking about it in relation to like autonomy and agency. So being in a space where I have control over my body, over my thinking, over how I kind of come to understand the flow of my life. I think it's really foundational to freedom. We often don't think about housing in terms of the kind of space it creates for us to think about your world, think about your relationships, your spirituality, your politics, and to kind of make meaning. We certainly do think about it in a roof over your head kind of more structural way. And I've had the pleasure of working with many colleagues who've tried to explode that definition. But at this moment in my life, I really am thinking about the ways in which home creates the opportunity to think and freedom of thought. But again, rests upon being in housing that is safe, that is secure, that is free from abuse, that reaches the standard of adequate housing. And as Katlia beautifully said, home is the beginning. It's the beginning of life in so many ways. And an honor to be here with each of you talking about this.
Yeah, a common theme I see across when people talk about it is that safety aspect, right? It's where I can be myself, and if I feel safe, I can think, I can start. It's where I start my day, it's where I end my day, and I could just be myself, right? And common themes around family as well. So thank you all for that. So today we're going to focus on two human rights claims that were submitted on June 14th. One is the Crisis Ends With Us from the Women's Network, and the other Homeless on Homelands from the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Working Group. Kaitlin, can you tell us a little bit about your submission, and then we'll go to Khulud and Katlia to expand as well on each claim.
Absolutely. So just a bit of background for listeners. For those of you who don't know, we have new legislation as of 2019 in Canada that establishes housing as a human right. The National Housing Strategy Act. And under this legislation, there's a new kind of human rights accountability process where groups and individuals can bring forward systemic housing issues for review by this independent human rights body, kind of a watchdog. So this process or this opportunity to create these submissions opened up just 2 months ago. So what we have been doing at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network over this year is building towards creating a human rights claim that really articulates what we see as some systemic housing issues that are deeply linked to gender. Our claim that we submitted, and you can find on our website at womenshomelessness.ca, kind of articulates that the housing system we're currently living in is not equitable, and that it has a discriminatory impact on marginalized women and gender diverse folks. And that this is really predicated on the ways in which we invisibilize the unique circumstances and needs of women and gender diverse folks when it comes to housing. And the argument we made is that the failure of the government of Canada to adequately address housing need and homelessness has manufactured a human rights crisis for marginalized women and gender diverse folks across Canada. And the effects are enormously severe. And I imagine many of your listeners will be familiar with them. We know women are separated from their children due to housing status. We know women and gender diverse folks remain trapped in situations of chronic poverty and abuse, remain vulnerable to exploitation. The ways in which we have known about this for decades and systematically underinvested in housing programs that can actually get at those issues, we are saying is a significant human rights issue, and it's an issue of discrimination as well. And what's important is that it's, there need not be necessarily an overt attempt at discrimination in housing policy, but the way it is landing in the lives of marginalized women and gender diverse folks has this discriminatory impact. And so what our claim attempted to do was assert that we have a right to housing, we have a right to substantive equality, we have a right to equitably benefit from investments in housing. And it's a really, really powerful moment, I think, for us as a movement. And I wanted to read just very briefly kind of a key statement in our claim in this regard. The claim states, "We see no future for ourselves in the current housing regime. Housing has become, in effect, the new frontier for the subordination of marginalized women and gender diverse people in Canada. While our present circumstances have been determined for us, the future is not yet decided. We offer this claim as part of our efforts to author a future for ourselves, our community, and our planet." So this is the kind of broad ethos of the claim, and throughout it, we document systemic issues we see in policy, do legal analysis, human rights analysis, and of course are guided by lived experts and their testimony, deputations, and leadership in establishing the claim. And we are truly urgently hoping that the advocate will review our claim and really look at this systemic issue. And we were very humbled to be able to put this claim forward in partnership with the National Feminist Indigenous Working Group or Housing Working Group. And Khulud and Katlia will speak to this, but it was just an honor to be creating this claim and launching it at the same time as that powerful group. So that's a bit of background. It's an exciting moment for us.
Yeah, very much so, and very powerful, and thank you for that. Khulud and Katlia, you'll speak to the second claim, I believe?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so yeah, we submitted alongside the Women's Network, and we highlighted 4 violations. One was the lack of action on the calls to justice for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report and the TRC calls to action. The second one is the failure to provide adequate and culturally appropriate housing on our own terms as Indigenous people. And the third is the interjurisdictional neglect, multiple system failure, and institutional betrayal of Indigenous people. And the fourth violation we had is the security of tenure under the National Housing Strategy Act and security of Indigenous land tenure, which is what I'm very interested in. Being from the Northwest Territories in particular, we see a lot of homelessness and housing issues here among Indigenous people, and we're taking this claim one step further, where we're not just submitting one claim, we're actually going to be advocating on the ground here in the Northwest Territories, helping people experiencing homelessness in particular to submit claims, because one of the problems is that the housing advocate's not really going to get all of the voices of people, because when people are homeless or experiencing the impacts of inadequate housing, they're not going to be sitting at a computer submitting a claim. Their main concern is getting a roof over their head and having housing. And a lot of the times in these northern communities, there's lack of access to internet. And I know that the government has been saying that they've been going to communities to try to get these submissions, but it's not enough. There are so many people experiencing homelessness and housing, and their voices are not being heard. So anything that we can do to make sure that we can submit those claims for them and help is what we're doing now going forward. And then we're also going to be hopefully using that data and that gathering of information for other purposes as well that are in line with Indigenous principles of living in line with the land and land back, and just all sorts of important initiatives of getting back to figuring out who really does have the underlying title in Canada when it comes to land claims. And it really just goes hand in hand with all aspects of, even when you're thinking about green energy and implementing green energy or getting off of the power grid, I really think that we can be innovative in our next steps when we talk about housing in general.
Thanks for that introduction, Katlia. And I think you captured the heart and soul of what the claims meant to be doing, which is giving communities across Canada that agency and power and control on their own human rights process, and to take essentially take the human rights claim that we've prepared at a very national level and actualize it, and actualize the process at a community level and at a local level. Because one thing that we know working with Indigenous communities across provinces and territories is their underlying realities are the same, but the actual context, the ways in which communities articulate what housing and home means to them is different, and it's unique, and it's rooted in the culture and practices and realities of those communities. So one of the really, I guess, big tasks that we've taken on with this claim, and really under the leadership of people like Katlia and Marie McGregor Pitawanakwet, who's our other co-chair on the working group, has been how do we not just talk about housing in isolation, because one of the most important and critical aspects of housing for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people is their relationship to land and the rights that they already have been promised through treaties, and the relationship that they have vis-a-vis treaty with the Canadian government and the Crown. So the articulation of housing rights in our claim has called for the federal housing advocate to take a transformative approach to human rights, to not just take a one-dimensional approach, but to human rights as articulated in NHSA, which is the National Housing Strategy Act, but also to be looking at it through the lenses of other rights instruments that Indigenous peoples have in Canada, and also to be looking at inherent Indigenous rights as articulated by Indigenous people themselves, the right that Indigenous people have, regardless of any colonial institution and what colonial institutions promise them. So really the claim is a 50-page document, and not necessarily something that has all the answers, but calls for the federal housing advocate and other bodies that are currently involved in human rights work to look at Indigenous housing from that lens, from the lens of inherent Indigenous rights, the lens of right to self-determination, land rights, and land justice. And how does housing fit in that picture? Because we can't isolate housing to being just providing someone a unit somewhere. We have to look at it and how communities articulate what that right means to them.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Now, these challenges you talk about, we were working on for a number of years. Now to get to this process, how did you get here? Why was this the chosen path forward? And why is it so important? Why should people really be pushing hard and getting behind this? I think we could start with Katlia and Khulud this time, and then we'll go to Kaitlin.
Well, for me, I got to this because I was the chair of my First Nation, Yellowknives Dene First Nation, for their housing program that was operated by the First Nation, but still very much controlled by the territorial government and CMHC, the federal government. And I got to see firsthand just the dispossession that the people in my community were experiencing. They were basically tricked into thinking that the homes that were being placed onto their land were going to be theirs one day and that they were renting to own. And somewhere along the way that changed hands, and the policy became one where they lost out on their land and their homes. And this happened quite right around all of the territories when housing came in. And one of the things housing did was it encroached on a lot of our communities without consent. And one family in particular that I know, this was only in the 1980s, they went out hunting in the fall for about 6 weeks, and they left their home by the water. Their home was a humble little shack. They didn't have running water or electricity, but they lived off the land in every way possible. They didn't need to work. They didn't need to make money. They were very content and happy. And they all went out, the whole family, the kids and all, went out on the land and hunted for 6 weeks and came back, and their home was completely gone and bulldozed to the ground. And housing came and put in a home pretty much right in the same spot, and then told them that they needed to pay rent, and they needed to work, and they needed to get educated because they couldn't get a job with the government if they didn't have the proper education. And so you just see this evolve, and all of these issues build and build upon each other. And now this family is completely separated. They're no longer unified. The grandmother was taken out of the home. The grandmother can no longer help to support the children and teach the language. The father can no longer go and hunt and teach his children how to hunt. It goes on, and now they're in thousands and thousands of dollars of arrears. And this is just one family. Housing, just like residential school, has affected every single one of the Indigenous people I know. So it is not just residential schools that has had an impact on Indigenous peoples in Canada. It is the housing system, it is the education system, it is the child welfare system, it is every single system of government that has impacted Indigenous people. And in the North, we are majority Indigenous people here, and we are not treated like the royalty that we should be, because these are our territorial lands. These are our ancestral lands since time immemorial, and that is why I'm here, and that is why I'm fighting to make sure that my mother no longer has to live in housing. My mother no longer has to walk the streets. I don't have to fear that if I'm living with a white man that I might get kicked out of the house and not even have my name on a lease because I am a woman. And so there's just so many issues that need to be brought forward because housing is so individualized. We can't just talk about it in one sector. We have to think about it in on-off reserve. We need to think about it in smaller pieces, because even though it's one big piece, there are so many small issues, and they can be tackled. But it's going to take people like us and people working together for a main vision to change that and to change the policies and push the government to make changes within their policies. It's a policy. It's not that hard to change. They've been doing it for years and years and years. The government has been doing it behind our backs for years, changing policies to fit their regime. So now we need to do the same.
And just adding to that, Michael, specifically engaging with the process of the Federal Housing Advocate is because it is a monumental decision, the right to housing getting recognized within Canadian law. And it does give the process of demanding accountability on the right to housing more teeth than it has before. And again, like recognizing that the Federal Housing Advocate and the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate is mainly looking at systemic issues, and it's not necessarily something that's currently we're challenging in courts. What we're really wanting to see is what Katlia said, policy change, trying to see what kind of systems level gaps and loopholes can be recognized and called out by the Federal Housing Advocate, and then essentially be directing governments to look seriously into the right to self-determination for Indigenous communities, and particularly when it comes to Indigenous women and gender diverse people, looking at how do you create reclamation of the roles that Indigenous women have always held in their communities as caretakers, as protectors, as home builders. So how do we create those sort of pathways through larger systemic changes. And that's really why we chose to engage with the Federal Housing Advocate. And it's not the only thing that the working group does. The working group is looking at all sorts of micro and macro tools that we can use to get to that reclamation of roles of Indigenous matriarchs in their community.
And can I just say that, in our Indigenous communities, women are the caregivers of the home. We are the leaders in the home. Before the Indian Act was in place, and even before colonization, we were the leaders. We took care of community. We kept everyone together. We carry our children in the womb. That's a home. And so from the very start, we are the caregivers, and that's why women need to lead this.
This is it's such an honor to be on this podcast with Katlia and Khulud. You speak so beautifully to this. And thank you so much for that question, Michael, and in terms of thinking about how did this come about and why is it important? And on our side at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, I think I link the work we do to a long history of intersectional feminist struggles. And, I think when I think about feminist organizing specifically around socioeconomic justice and equity and what that looks like for women and gender diverse people. And we know that housing and access to housing is one of the key determinants of socioeconomic status. And we know women and gender diverse folks are facing really severe inequality in that area. And this is something that feminists have been struggling for decades. In Canada, for example, if you were a woman, you couldn't open a bank account till 1964 without your husband's signature. So even access to capital of any kind, there's been a long history of struggle that I think sometimes we can forget that have gotten us to improvements in terms of equity. And we have to have a kind of a deep understanding and knowledge of this history. And that's where I place our claim in part of a larger history of organizing for justice and equity on the basis of gender and other intersections. And kind of in this tradition of seeking justice through a human rights lens as well, and through human rights accountability. And that's in part why this legislation is so powerful. And for anyone who's listening to this, I would just deeply encourage you to look at the legislation, the National Housing Strategy Act, and think about, okay, this is a new tool in our toolbox in terms of movement building, in terms of thinking about what housing justice looks like in Canada. And its power will in part be determined by the extent to which we seize it and we make it meaningful. And so when I think about, okay, why is this claim important? What's different about it? It really is for us an assertion of our right to equality, or our right to housing, and a kind of rallying cry around there isn't a future for folks in the current housing system. We are one of the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world. It is completely absurd, as I'm sure all the listeners would agree, that in such a wealthy country, there is no reason we don't ensure adequate access to adequate housing for all people. That it violates our inherent dignity, our inherent rights. So it's part of that history that I see driving this claim. I see us as part of that struggle and intersectional struggles, and in deep solidarity with the struggles of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited folks who are advancing their inherent rights to land, to housing in the ways that Katlia so beautifully articulates. So I'll leave it there.
It's interesting. I think so many people, right? A large part of why we do this podcast is awareness, right? Because there's a lot of assumptions made. We've come so far. Canada's a great country. We've got all sorts. There's been so many changes. And there has been progress. But as we've seen, especially with our neighbors to the south, a few steps forward, many steps back. I am a positive person. But, you would hope, in a perfect world, there would not be a need for a claim like this. But this is far from perfect. We see the injustice here. But this is a huge undertaking. And I know this wasn't an overnight process. I see Khulud nod, yes, 50-page document, lots of people involved. Can you talk to us a little bit about the process, how this all comes together? So people may not understand how this all comes together and how you submit it. Can you walk us through the process a little bit?
I was really burning to say this for the last question, and I think it's a good answer for this question as well, which is when we first brought up. So we work with the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Working Group, where Katlia and Marie, who I was mentioning earlier, chair the working group. And when Kaitlin first talked to me about this, and I brought this to the working group, one of the things that many people in the working group articulated is that Indigenous people don't need colonial governments to grant them rights. And I think that is a very important articulation, that the engagement with, and that's what we built our process around, that our engagement with the Federal Housing Advocate was in no way to situate Indigenous people in this position of asking for their rights to be met. It really is a process of seeing where and how the Canadian government is putting barriers in Indigenous people meeting their own needs and their own rights to self-determination. So when we started asking questions and started building out the process, what we started talking to people about was not what housing situation was looking like in their communities and stuff, because I think communities have been talking about it for years and years and years. And I truly believe that it's against folks' dignity to consistently be asking them what are the challenges that they're going through. This is not the first time that we've engaged on a housing process. What we started talking about was how is it, what does a human rights process look like when it's led by Indigenous people? What are the priorities? Where would they want focuses to be? What does solution building look like? And that's where we were able to get to these really rich conversations about land rights and self-determination and women's roles, because really that's what the human rights process and engagement in human rights process is for the communities that we've talked to so far. They're interested in solution building. They're interested in self-determination. They're no longer looking towards the government to come and meet a certain need in their community, because the government has failed them multiple times and continues to fail them, and unfortunately fails to make any space for them to take on their own self-determination. So this is so much more, for us, so much more was about how do we shift the narrative before, the Federal Housing Advocate really gets the chance to articulate. How do we kind of get into the door and let them know that we're not trying to get any sort of housing rights articulated that doesn't come from the Indigenous communities, and any sort of human process that's coming in should be coming from the communities. And I'll stop there, and I'll just pass it on to maybe Katlia or Kaitlin, who wants to go next.
Yeah, I mean, Kaitlin and Khulud have done a lot of the work leading up to this, putting together everything and getting people in the same room and navigating all of these different moving parts and coordinating the logistics around meetings and things like that, and just getting people in the room to discuss these important issues. So I'm really thankful to them for getting that all, that background work done. But I just wanted to say, for me, I'm not advocate for housing. I'm an advocate for autonomy and home ownership in the form of green energy. So our group is really looking to be able to have women build their own homes on their own lands in their own way they want them to be, where it actually feels like a home, where they're not paying an arm and a leg to live. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of confusion when we say housing, because housing can mean many things, but for me, housing means autonomy over where you live, and a sense of pride and a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose to the greater community and a healthy community. So when we can get to that, that's all the better, and that's where we're headed. We're looking to do that work as much as possible, and not just sit in meetings and talk, but actually put this into action. And we're on the ground, and we're doing this action as fast as possible, because we know this is an emergency. It's immediate need. I mean, when I walk to work and I go into the building, there are homeless people sleeping on the ground, trying to get out of the sun, and I have to walk past them, and that, you know, it's so hard when I'm working in this field and in this environment and I'm trying to make change and I'm not seeing the change happen fast enough. And then here I am living, you know, in a comfortable life, and I'm doing this work, and I always keep myself in check and remember that, you know, it can all be taken away from me too very quickly. And I'm very thankful that I have people that I can lean on for support to help me to be where I am today. So it is a matter of working together as much as possible to help other people, because some people really do need that assistance, and without it, it's very discouraging to navigate these systems of change. Like, if it's hard for us, it's hard for somebody that doesn't have a home to do this work. So we have to be those advocates, and we have to be those voices.
Oh, that's so beautifully said, Katlia. I think when I think about what we've been doing on the Women's Network side, it is in that spirit of like tremendous urgency and this deep desire for collaborative work to drive forward much better human rights outcomes that we know are achievable. So in a very practical way, in terms of what we actually did to build this claim, we pulled together a task force of about 30 women and gender diverse folks across the country, really spanning expertise, and lived expert leadership was really key to that. So we were always guided by lived experts in the work we did and how we articulated the claim. And yeah, it was a ton of meetings, a ton of talking about prioritization and analysis, and how do we think about this, and what do we really want here, and what does it mean for housing to be a human right, and all of those kind of debates and thinking is what formed our claim. And we were really lucky to bring in a number of experts to also guide us, and we had Bruce Porter, who's international human rights expert in the area of housing, who supported our work. And yeah, it was a very beautiful process. And from here, what we're heading towards is doing some evidence gathering around the human rights violations that folks are experiencing across the country, to create space for local organizing, but also for lived experts to be articulating what the right to housing means for them personally. But what I would say, just for anyone who's listening, you know, both of our groups went through these distinct processes that we developed ourselves. But you can also do a claim, and it doesn't take that long. Like, you can do one as an individual, and it can take an hour or 2 hours, or you could do one as a group, as an organization. So that's just to say there's tremendous opportunities to engage with this legislation and this human rights body that's not necessarily as like months long robust in the ways that ours were, but can be really meaningful and rich as well.
Thank you all for that. Now, June 14th, you put in the claims. What has the response been so far? Kaitlin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, the response has been so moving, frankly, because what we've heard from women and gender diverse folks across the country is like, I see myself in this claim. I see my reality, my experience, the ways in which my rights, my dignity, my sense of self are being eroded by how we organize housing, and particularly how we organize it in relation to people's identities and their social locations. And in our case, we're very focused on gender and understanding the ways in which we're really missing that part in terms of how we deliver housing. So the most important thing, I think, for us is hearing directly from folks who are experiencing homelessness or housing need, who are saying, this matters to me. I see myself in this. How can I get involved? So we've had a whole bunch of folks reach out about, you know, I want to do evidence gathering in my community. How do I take this claim and move it forward in my community? And fortunately, there was also we did a big launch of these claims on Parliament Hill on June 14th, quite a powerful event. You can see the video on womenshomelessness.ca. And there was great media uptake. So that was really exciting, especially for the Indigenous claim. it was really thrilling to see the extent of media interest and the ways in which it resonated on the ground for folks. So yeah, exciting response so far.
And Katlia, the Indigenous community, has there been a good response to it? What have you heard?
Well, so far, to be honest, there's been a fear-based response. Some people are afraid to come forward and share their experiences in the housing system and being homeless, because what if they say something that will get them evicted? There's distrust in the government. We have to explicitly let people know that we are not government affiliated, we are independent, and hopefully we can gain that trust, and we're not just compiling information and putting it on a shelf like every other report, that we're actually going to do something about it. And so yeah, it's about building that trust, and it's still very new. Like, we're still just unrolling the community level submission claims. So, but what I've heard so far is that there is a fear of kind of, saying something and then having that retribution or repercussions from that. So yeah, that's my job, is to try to make people feel as comfortable as possible to share their stories, because it's important that we hear what they have to say in order to make change. But then it's very disheartening when that change actually doesn't happen, and they've, like Khulud said, they've said their story millions of times over and nothing ends up happening, and it's very discouraging, and it's defeatist. So hopefully this is not just another, we hope to let them know that we can work with them, and we will follow up with people where it's very individualistic, where we're making, building relations. And there's also a lot of other women across Canada doing this work too, and trying to do startups in the same way that we are. And we're trying to let them know, we're not stepping on toes, we're not competing with each other. Yeah, our work might be overlapping, but it's important work. And so how can we work together and unify and make ourselves even stronger in partnership?
Yeah, I can see where that, so many years of distress, it's hard to. And for a lot of people, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it's great that you're doing this. When I see action, maybe you'll have my buy-in, but until that action happens, we've been through this before, right? Khulud, anything to add on the response? What have you seen?
Everything that Kaitlin and Katlia added, I think the only thing I'll say is we're really interested in working with folks that are already doing this work in their communities. This is not at all about stepping on anyone's toes or taking up space that folks have built through their own community building and relationship building processes. This is about strengthening relationships and centering all of that energy in some form of a movement building capacity. So, realities look different. Northern Ontario looks very different from Toronto. Northwest Territories looks very different from what's happening, in Calgary. So we have to acknowledge those realities, and we have to acknowledge that the people that are living those realities and, reckoning with those systems of power have the most amount of knowledge on what to do with it. So how do you make the human rights process add power to the work that they're already doing? And for me, in supporting the work that the National Working Group has been doing, in supporting the work that Marie and Katlia do, for me, the biggest question has been, how do we use our energies to build power at local level? And that's where a lot of my interest is on working with Kaitlin on this, and in working with Katlia on this as well.
Well, let's stay on that theme. You're talking about, I know Katlia talked about this as well, we talked about action, right? So you submit the claims. What are the hopes moving forward? What does action look like? What does success look like with these claims pushing forward? We'll start with you, Khulud.
Oh, I get to speak again. To be quite honest, I think success looks like how communities articulate success. For a community, we're working with advocates that see success in tenant power and tenant organizing, then that's what success looks like. We're working with communities that want urban land back and urban land presence for Indigenous women and gender diverse people. That's what success looks like. So really, the human rights process on the Indigenous women and gender diverse people end of things, the success is whatever they articulated, given their realities and given their contexts. On the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network side of things, success is seeing real concrete commitments and policy change. And not to say that that's not what success is looking like on Indigenous end of things as well, but really seeing how people can hold accountability and speak their truth to power, and getting accountability from different levels of government, not just the federal government, because we know that it's not all in the hands of federal government when it comes to housing. We need to see municipal level change. We need to see provincial level change. And I always say that municipalities are where a lot of action happens, and how do we create power at that local level. So again, very similar line of thought, but in different ways of doing things. And then at the end of the day, building local power, for me, I would say, like, the more organized we are in communicating what we want to see, the more power there is in all of this. So if we can add that capacity, build that power, connect people, do very strong relationship building, let folks know that we're not out here trying to be a mouthpiece for any body of government, but we're really there to help them build power in their communities, I see that to be the way forward. And that's how I would at least articulate success.
Kaitlin or Katlia, what does action look like? I know there's many steps to this, and there's this this end goal of housing, right? If I hear, let's get safe, affordable housing of my choice. But what does action look like to you? When will the communities say, "Well done"?
Whoa, huge question, Michael. That's a good one. Katlia, you go ahead first.
Okay. Yeah, that is a big question, but I think when housing no longer perpetuates poverty and violence, and when housing corporations no longer capitalize on poverty, that's when we'll know when we're successful. And sometimes it takes a small pilot project, like a tiny home community that's off-grid, where people are helping one another, and where money is not factored in, where people are literally living, again, for free. Right now, housing is so expensive across the board, people can't afford to live. So let's stop making it about money. Let's just completely keep money out of the equation. I know that sounds absolutely absurd and radical, but it can be done. We need to set our sights on the power corporations that are intricately linked to housing, where they don't want to give up control, because if they give up control of the status quo, business as usual, and let go of greenhouse gases, they're no longer going to make money, right? But there are ways, and we know that people can live completely off-grid. Green energy, solar, biomass, wind, all these intermittent technologies put together can actually sustain entire communities. And we need to start actually looking at that and seeing how that can pair with housing, and really just tackle all of these corporations, these governments that are working together that are not wanting to make that change.
So beautifully articulated. I would, when I think about what success looks like, both Khulud and Katlia always articulate what transformative change really is, like all the way from the municipal to the national and international level, and inspired by both of them when they speak about this. When I think in kind of concrete terms around this particular claim and where we're headed with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, we are looking for very concrete policy changes, including in the area of financialization in many of the ways that Katlia just articulated. But also a ton of our research over the last few years has been looking at the National Housing Strategy and identifying the ways in which there are significant inequities on the basis of gender, on the basis of disability, on the basis of race, in terms of outcomes. And our hope would be that we would have a national housing strategy that would be aligned with the human right to housing. And this is articulated in legislation. This is how it's written in the legislation. This is the official housing policy of Canada. And so what we're hoping for, in part with this claim, is a realignment with the human right to housing as it's articulated in law, in policy. So a lot of our work has been to document where there are divergences and what it would take to get closer, what it would take to really be getting at substantive equality, to really be prioritizing those most in need, to getting at building a housing system that is not based on the commoditization of land and property, but is based on housing as a social good and foundational to human connection and human life, and in the ways that Khulud and Katlia articulate so beautifully. But yeah, that's a podcast episode unto itself, Michael. What change looks like, what action looks like. I love that question. Thank you so much for that.
And can I just say that money does matter when it comes to us getting the funding to do this work. Yeah, so money is definitely important in that way with philanthropy. So if there's any philanthropists out there listening, we would gladly accept the funds. Also too, I mean, when it comes to the power corporations, I myself have had my power turned off as a single mother because my bill was late, $75. So there are people that are having their power cut off in the Northwest Territories, and it is happening. It's illegal to do this, but I believe it is happening in minus 40 degrees weather. So if you take that into consideration, you and your family sitting in the dark, freezing, that's a real concern, and we need to really look at. That's why I'm so advocating for looking into the power corporations as well and taking them to task.
Yeah, so I mean, just over the last while too, and you see it, it's always been there. There's this greed, right, from corporations, and that's why. And listen, we could call it many different things, but it is greed. Last week, reading about how your major grocers, it's above inflation. It's just greed, wanting more, and who is that on the backs of, right? And all these people already, power corporations doing that with power, and is that the society we want to live in, right? And that is another podcast as well. But it does come down to greed. Now, we've had policy experts like yourselves be on the show, and they said, look, homelessness is a direct result of bad policy. We need better policy. Can we all agree on that? And one of the actions coming out of this would be some major policy changes that would result in the actions that you've all spoken so beautifully about. So people want to get involved. Right, and that's what I heard Khulud saying. Hey, look, this is only going to work if that kind of groundswell, that local groundswell. And I loved what you said too. I remember Adam Vaughn talking about it. He said, look, you need all three levels of government to cooperate on this, or nothing's going to happen. Right, the feds can pump all sorts of money, but it stops at the territories and provinces, and then it stops at municipalities, right, with the different rules. So you need all three. Not an easy task. We know of that, right? You have different terms of government, different types of government in there, but we need that to happen. How can people get involved as an individual, or if there's the groups out there that you're talking about doing amazing work that you want to work with, not against, how do they get involved in this and be part of this amazing groundswell pushing forward for change?
Maybe I'll start with some practical stuff around the claim and then pass it on. So what we would love to see, and I think is incredibly powerful, is having individuals, groups, and organizations submit their own claim in solidarity with either both or one of these two claims. So sending in an articulation of the human rights violations that you're experiencing in the area of housing. It doesn't take that long. You just go to the Federal Housing Advocate Office's website, and you can submit a claim probably between an hour and 3 hours, and articulate, like, I submit this claim in support of these broader claims that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network have put forward, and the National Feminist Indigenous Housing Working Group has as well. So I would just kindly ask all of the readers to engage in that way, or let the office know that you support these claims. And please read the claims, go to womenshomelessness.ca, check them out, and, all the stuff around subscribing and that kind of thing. But so that's on the practical side. On kind of the more aspirational side, we really need to be moving towards a re-articulation of what housing means. And so building local thinking, local power on what does the right to housing look like for me, for my community, and where are there opportunities and levers for change, just reach out to us. We're very, very interested in partnering with any organizations or groups who are looking at the intersection of gender and housing and thinking about it from a human rights lens and a feminist lens.
Khulud or Katlia, anything to add about people getting involved?
Well, I would just say that there's also one other government that's very important, the nation to nation with First Nations, Indigenous people, Métis, Inuit. They need to be at the table for sure when talking about policy reform. And yeah, it comes down to legislative change and amendments, and also just those minor policies that are actually very easy to change within branches of government, but they somehow try to act like they're very difficult. So yeah, I mean, it's about getting the First Nations to get on board as well, because here in my home territory, one of the issues that we're up against is just the land allocations. And if somebody's not a member of the reserve, then, well, why would they allow them to come into their community? And so there's a lot of like intricacies that way, and having to figure out how First Nations are able to help their members, but also possibly help others that are living on their territory, or those that are living off of reserve that need assistance. And often the funding that is provided to First Nations is only for on reserve. So really making sure to include that into the conversation is important.
Absolutely, and thank you for that clarification as well.
I think Katlia and Kaitlin have captured everything I would have wanted to say, Michael. I'd just add that if folks want to work together, if they see value in this work and they want to reach out, I wonder if we're able to put out some, womenshomelessness.ca is the easiest place to kind of get in touch with us. And we have information lined up there, and really, really interested in looking at how people articulate their own ways of what human rights, housing as a human right looks to them. And that's where I think the power is. And I really hope that our efforts are leading towards that.
I absolutely think they are. It's when we first started talking about housing as a human right, not having a policy background myself, I was like, well, so what does that mean? Right. And so does that mean that everyone, now that that's passed, can demand housing? And so we look for some examples of that. And I always think of the one in Wales where it's the duty to assist, for certain, and again, they have certain populations. I think women with children being one of them, saying, listen, you've got 2 weeks. Government is 2 weeks to find housing, suitable, affordable housing. Otherwise, they're held liable. And now I don't know how that all plays out. If they don't, what the ramifications are. But I love the action pieces of, you've got to really have it. It has to have some teeth. And I have no doubt, with the three of you leading the way and many others who are doing incredible work, that we are going to have some action steps with real teeth. We're going to see policy changes pushing forward. So thank you so much for you're incredibly busy people. I know that. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast to talk about this brilliant work and this important work. And please keep pushing forward. It's so appreciated by so many.
Thank you so much for having us, Michael. It's always an honor to connect with you and to connect with Katlia and Khulud.
Likewise.
Masicho, thank you.
Wow. I learn a lot on most podcasts. I learned a heck of a lot today. And it's complex, but it's not. It kind of starts and ends with housing. That's what it is. Affordable, safe housing for all. Kaitlin said it during the, in a country like Canada, it's a pretty basic need. Why can't we get this straight? We know the solutions. They're all out there. Katlia talked about it too. You have tiny home communities. There's all sorts of projects that we've seen that work, and that can happen real quick, right? We saw it during the pandemic when you had political will and you had money, how quick this sector can mobilize to house people and make it work, right? That's what you need. And I think with these strong individuals leading the way and so many amazing leaders pushing forward this work, the future is positive, but we do need your help. So if you're listening to this podcast, as Kaitlin said, support the claim, write your own claim supporting the claim. It doesn't take long. If you need help, I'm sure you could reach out and they'll help you shape it. But this is how it's going to work. It's got to help it happen. That groundswell on the local level has to happen. It looks a little different for everyone, as Khulud said, right? looks a little different, but we can make this happen. We have to do it together. The voices of lived experts are needed. We want to hear from you. So please keep pushing forward. And if you want to check out the claim, go to the website, as mentioned on this podcast. Be part of the solution. Wow. One of my favorites so far. Another great episode. Some great guests. We'll see you next time on The Way Home.